Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back. This time with a reaction video. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Bajan Englishman. You could call me Bajan, or yeah, you could just call me Bajan. We're gonna be reacting to how did the American Civil War actually happen, okay? I am a history buff, I am a history nerd, so I will be giving my own input into this video. So stay tuned to the end of this video if you want to see my input. Now, I don't have a tripod for my mic. My headset isn't working properly, so you're gonna have to see me holding my mic to my hand a lot when I'm gonna be giving my comments. So let's begin.
1819. The newly born United States of America sat in a state of delicate balance. 11-11. 11 free states, 11 slave states. From the outside looking in, it appeared to be perfect harmony. Equal states, equal
I don't really know how that could be perfect harmony. Okay.
representation, equal influence in federal affairs. But this was only from the outside looking in. In reality, there was no focus on balance for the Americans. Instead, all
Yes. In my personal opinion, I do believe that the Civil War began not because of slaves, but it was more because of an economics war. But I'm gonna let him speak and see what he says.
that mattered now was expansion. Manifest destiny. That was the reason why the United States government was hell-bent on snagging more and more territory. Although the phrase wouldn't be coined until the mid-1800s, the belief held by many Americans that it was the nation's destiny to expand westward as far as can be done drove the U.S. to do just that. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Louisiana.
You know, it always blows my mind how America is like a federation. I never really viewed America as a federation. Like I live in America, and honestly, it does not really feel like a federation. A federation is like a very distinct, very diverse, group of states that are all united as one state, hence the name United States of America. But it never really did felt like that, really and truly. A country that really did feel more like a federation, in my personal opinion, would be Russia. I know it's very counterintuitive, but Russia has a bunch of like ethnic groups and ethnic republics that are all united into one country. That feels more like a federation than the United States. Because the United States, right, is just mostly like white Americans just essentially creating their own territories like you see right here. The Missouri Territory, the Arkansas Territory, and whatnot. And they so-called call it a state. It just doesn't really feel like a federation, really and truly. Unlike places like Russia, which actually has like diverse people with their own unique culture and whatnot. I don't know. That's just my personal opinion.
Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama. That was the whole of the United States thus far as of 1819. But only a year later, this would change. In 1818, the Missouri Territory, previously obtained as part of the Louisiana Purchase, began its push for statehood. The following year, the District of Maine would be allowed to break off from Massachusetts and do the same. It didn't take long for this to cause a conundrum for the contemporary U.S., however, because the addition of
Yeah, you see, this is what I'm talking about. Like how he said, Maine broke away. It's just like, you know, it's just the same people, same group, same culture. Although personally, I think America has no culture. And then, America is supposed to be a federation. But anyways,
two more states had the potential to upset the numerical balance between slave states and free states. On the one hand, Northerners and pro-abolitionists in Congress argued that the addition of Missouri, which seemed to quickly lean toward wanting to become a slave state, would expand slavery and thus bring them further away from their goals. The Southerners, though, were obviously in favor of adding another slave state, and thus argued that any new candidate for statehood should have the right to decide for themselves, just as the first 13 colonies, which side on the fence they want to fall on.
I never understood the South needed slaves because their economy was extremely dependent on that. But I never really understood why couldn't the South have industrialized, right? The North had industrialized. Why couldn't the South have done that? They were very agrarian. It kind of reminds me of the imperial state of Russia, the Russian Empire before World War One. We saw that after the Soviet Union replaced the Russian Empire, they industrialized in like 5 years. Granted, it killed a bunch of people. But I don't know. It makes me wonder, like, why couldn't the South have just industrialized like the North, and they wouldn't have needed slavery. But
Debate in both the House of Representatives and the Senate would continue into 1819, at which point Maine was now brought into the mix, as Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House at the time, suggested that Missouri should be added to the Union as a slave state, but that Maine should also be added, contrarily, as a free state. This proposal was subsequently debated into yet another year, when in 1820, the Senate added to the bill, requiring that any other territories north of the 36° 30' latitude line that had been agreed upon below Missouri's lower border could only enter the Union as free states, with everyone finally in some level.
When you have these woke revolutions, it requires all of us at some point to say no, not
30 latitude line that had been agreed upon below Missouri's lower border could only enter the Union as free states. With everyone finally in some level of agreement, the Missouri Compromise was signed into law. This triggered a tit-for-tat war of adding one new slave state for every new free state and vice versa, starting with Arkansas in 1836, Michigan the next year, and Florida in 1845. And since Florida was a slave state, it was assumed that the next territory to enter the Union and statehood would be another free state. But this became complicated when Texas had a demanding request for the United States: annex us now. The history.
okay, so that's not how it really happened. I think if anyone knew the Mexican-American War, Texas had a bunch of settlers that the United States sent to it that largely influenced that. So it wasn't just like annex us now, but he's oversimplifying. So yeah, I get it.
The history of Texas has been a roller coaster thus far, and yet it was only now preparing for its biggest climb yet. Texas, up until recently a part of Mexico after being freed from the grip of the Spaniards, wanted to join a different union, the USA. The Texans' pleas were initially ignored by the US government, which wasn't in much favor of annexing the nearby territory, with growing pressure from Britain for Texas to be an independent nation and America's undeniable thirst for expansion. Opinions would soon change nevertheless, and Texas would, in fact, join the Union on December 29th, 1845. Here was the issue, though. Texas wanted to be a slave state, which would offset the balance the Northerners had tried so hard to keep. Furthermore, Texas had made claims to territories that put it in direct conflict with its former host of Mexico. And with Texas newly a part of the United States, those presumptuous claims were now the responsibility of the U.S., something that Mexico didn't take lightly. Recently elected President James K. Polk, however, didn't care one bit what the Mexicans thought. Instead, he was an aggressive supporter of Manifest Destiny, and quickly upon his inauguration hoped to seize the contested territories. Thus, Polk at first attempted to purchase his desired lands. He sent American diplomat John Slidell to offer the administration in Mexico City $30 million in exchange for California, New Mexico, and disputed territory.
$13 million. How much is that in today's money? Like, damn, $13 million for that? It's funny because in the end, they did still pay Mexico for the territory that they lost, so.
Territories along the Texas border. The Mexicans, aghast and unshakably against such an idea, declines to even meet Slidell, which angered Polk. The Manifest Destiny supporter would not be swayed by this rejection, and instead decided that, if diplomacy wouldn't work, he would reel his neighbors into a war he knew the United States would win. As a result, in the early weeks of 1846, the president sent American troops to the Texas border to egg the Mexicans on. And it worked. It only took a few months for Mexican soldiers to fire on the Americans and give Polk the excuse to declare war. With the Mexican-American War underway, debates continued within the United States pertaining to the slave state versus free state debacle. With the free states now outnumbered, the Northerners felt that Polk, being a Southerner himself, was actually committing his land grab in order to further bolster the slave state advantage, which boosted North to South tensions.
I didn't know that.
Still, the war raged on, with now famed generals like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee showing their prowess and adding to their resumes, while the Americans inched closer to Mexico's capital.
I didn't know that.
The city was
Grant
eventually
was in
taken
this war?
and warfare halted, leading to the long-awaited treaty.
Wait, Grant was in this war. What? I think that the American-Mexican War is critically underrated. A lot of people should study that war a lot more. People usually just gloss over that war. Like, I remember I watched a documentary about it a long time ago, but I forgot most of it. Mexico had a general, Santa Anna or something like that. Guy was badass, though.
Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which now forced Mexico to cede not only the contested territories in California, Arizona, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, but also lands of modern-day Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Polk had gotten his way and more. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. New land.
America also did still pay Mexico the territory. Funny thing is, America could have annexed all of Mexico, but they chose not to because they didn't want to deal with all of that extra, like Spanish people and all that extra territory they managed down south, which may have caused unrest. And to be fair, it was a pretty good choice. Interesting how this region right here that borders California is also called Baja California too. California was an independent country. He did not point that out. He just like gave California to the U.S. California was an independent country. They have fought a war with Mexico as well. He did not point that out. That's okay.
And more to fight over back home. Over the next few years, Iowa, Wisconsin, and California would all give their bids for statehood, eventually bringing about the Compromise of 1850. This series of bills would address a multitude of things, though mostly focused on the institution of slavery within the Union. In short, it determines that California would join the Union as a free state, but was required to send one pro-slavery senator to the Senate in order to maintain the readjusted balance. From now on, however, slave or free states from the remaining territories gained from Mexico would be decided as such by popular sovereignty. This went all right at first, as would the admission to statehood of Minnesota in 1858 and Oregon in 1859. But predictably, there was simultaneously another reason for tensions to rise. As part of the new establishment of popular sovereignty, Senator Stephen Douglas suggested applying this strategy to a proposed newly organized Nebraska territory that would at once repeal the Missouri Compromise slave state border and split the Nebraska territory in two. Now, despite a struggle to actually pass the new bill that would become known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the populations of both territories were left to vote on whether they wished to permit slavery or not.
The highest art is beautiful.
The consequence of this, and maybe unpredictably so, was that settlers began flooding to both Nebraska and Kansas, settlers from both sides of the slavery debate. This slippery slope ushered in a tragic era known as Bleeding Kansas, which would eventually see Kansas enter the Union in 1861, surprisingly, as a free state. This would be the final state admitted to the Union before the start of the Civil War. Why did things...
You know, it's funny because that democracy has so much flaws in it that, you know, they say for the people, by the people, but how should you execute that democracy? Because as you can see right here, like a bunch of people that weren't even from Kansas just came to Kansas and they just, you know, try to influence the vote in their favor despite the fact that they weren't even in Kansas. I mean, that's a whole different video, but I don't know. Democracy, I never really viewed it too lightly. But again, that's a whole different thing.
Things get to this point. How could such a young nation have fallen into battle with itself so fast? Why were the North and South so opposed to each other? The issue of slavery, and thus the North versus South contention, can be blamed on vastly different cultural aspects of the two halves of America. For the North, slavery was not really needed, as the upper states had quickly become industrialized and thus didn't have to rely on as much manpower. This gave Northern citizens the opportunity to unbiasedly consider the moral standing of the entire institution of slavery, prompting many to call it into question. Supported by the ideas of European immigrants who had come from nations that had already outlawed slavery.
Oh my goodness gracious me. Okay, I want to point this out, right? Because from my country, Barbados, right? It was still a colony at this time during the British Empire, right? When the British Empire outlawed slavery, I tell people this all the time. Slavery in Barbados was much more tame compared to like slavery in America. Like I always tell people, if I had to go back in time and I had to choose a place to be a slave, I would definitely be a slave in Barbados. Because slavery in Barbados, due to the fact that it was an island, number one, and number two, due to the fact that it was a colony of Britain, a lot of British people did really despise slavery. And the vast majority of British people despise slavery. This was one of the main influences of why slavery ended up like being abolished in the British Empire at like 30 years before America did. Like I tell people, like it wasn't really like a white versus black thing. It was more of a wealth divide. And not only that, but the Continental War was also partially started because of slavery, but they don't really talk about that. But that's a whole different topic that I might probably explain if I react to American War of Independence. But yeah, like I'm glad you point that out because these immigrants mostly came from Britain. They mostly came from Britain, and they brought their ideals with them to the North, which eventually influenced the North to be more anti-slavery as well. So, yeah, that's...
These Northerners began to turn toward abolitionism. This was in total opposition to their fellow Americans down south, of course. But this was because the South had failed to industrialize as the North had. Instead, Southerners were more economically dependent on free labor for plantations and the like, which meant that their personal finances and way of life could be entirely affected by the banning of slavery, thus making it hard for a Southerner to even give the moral aspect a second thought, though some did and still supported the institution. And with the invention of the cotton gin, the matter only became more solidified. The South needed slavery. The problem then arose as the North wondered if Southerners wanted to extend slavery even further, whereas the latter worried that the former was going to take the slaves they already had. Both, ironically, would be right. The North and South were miles away from reconciling this difference. Debatably, there was also the issue of federal versus state rights, although this factor is hard to blame entirely. Not only did the later formed Confederacy have a shockingly large bureaucratic system for a collection of states who were opposed to overbearing federal governments, but there had also been previous opportunities, such as during the nullification crisis a few decades prior, for the South to go to war with the North, or at least raise more of a ruckus if state rights were the core issue. Still, it is true that many people at the time, particularly in the South, had more loyalty to their state than country as a whole, and state
Americans do not have a culture. Really and truly, I've spoken to many people about this. Like, Americans don't have a culture. It makes sense why back then they felt more loyalty to their state, because America as a whole just does not have a culture. Like, I'm sorry to break this to Americans, but they just don't have a culture. Like, I've lived here for like 8 years now. Oh my goodness, American culture is nothing. It's just Hollywood, freaking pop culture, something like that, dude. It's just like, nah.
versus federal disconnect likely played somewhat of a role in tensions, even if second fiddle to the slavery argument. The fanning of the flames, however, came from a string of amplifying events. The Fugitive Slave Act, for example, had been part of the Compromise of 1850 and galvanized abolitionists, as it had made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and penalizing escaped slaves.
Not all heroes wear capes. Some carry multimeters and save the day when the temp is going up
and anyone who aided them, even if they made it to a free state. With the Northerners deeply troubled by this development, politically active citizens of the upper United States would soon form their own opposition party to the pro-slavery Democrats, the Republican Party.
Bro, it's funny to me how no one, like today, like in this politically correct world that we live in, no one like realizes that the Democrats were the ones who were so hell-bent on keeping slavery, and it was the same Democrat Party who, after the Civil War, were hell-bent on keeping Jim Crow to punish the free African Americans, slaves. The Republicans were not like that. African Americans voted favorably for Republicans a lot for a long time after the Civil War. So it's so ironic how the Democrat Party tries to be the moral party, but it's just a sham. It's just complete BS. Like, dude. And so many people fall for it because we live in the age of social media where people don't use critical thinking and whatnot. But it is what it is.
This new entity would also become host to the controversial Abraham Lincoln shortly after its birth. Lincoln had previously served in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846 before joining the Republicans and running for Senate a decade later. Although he lost the Senate race to Stephen Douglas, the series of speeches and debates that preceded the election had both catapulted him to popularity in the North while earning him a fair share of enemies in the South. His mere existence as a political entity thus stirred the pot and increased tensions. But then, so did Bleeding Kansas. Guerrilla warfare is one way that this period from 1855 through 1859 has been described. While Nebraska was somewhat hit by the flood of both pro- and anti-slavery settlers hoping to sway the coming vote, it was Kansas that was truly beaten. Pro-slavery residents of neighboring states used legal loopholes to cross the border and vote in Kansas's territorial elections, setting off a domino.
This is what I was talking about. Democracy is a lot of the times I've noticed that a lot of democracies have these legal loopholes that I look at them. Sometimes I'm like, was this there purposely? Like, come on, like you're gonna write a system that's not supposed to be abusive, that's not supposed to have any like tips and tricks, and then it just doesn't make any sense that all these loopholes are there. Even now today, there's a bunch of loopholes in the US government system that is just blatantly obvious and nobody talks about it whatsoever.
Effect that would lead to a split government and all-out violence. Historians estimate that anywhere from 50 to 200 Americans died as a consequence in the 4-year span, something akin to pouring a couple of gallons of gasoline on the growing fire, burning towards civil war. Charles Sumner's congressional speech about Kansas would further heighten the situation. A Republican Northerner, Sumner had actually memorized every last word in his impassioned speech titled The Crime Against Kansas, in which he lambasted the entire institution of slavery and even took direct jabs at pro-slavery senators. This instance serves as a clear example of the current level of tensions in the Union and Congress, as South Carolina Representatives Preston Brooks and Lawrence Keitt reacted to the damning speech by physically assaulting Charles Sumner with a cane, beating him so severely that he would need 3 full years of leave to recover. And this was only a year before one of the most controversial and anger-fueling incidents of the entire lead-up to the...
So you're telling me that... Wait. Wait. You're telling me that this guy was beaten that bad? Like, you're telling me that all those people are around and like no one didn't like instantly try to stop him from like beating him? They just watched him like just kept beating so... Okay.
The Civil War. It was the Dred Scott case that soon put the move toward all-out military conflict between the North and South into hyperdrive. The case revolved around a slave since birth by the name of Dred Scott. After the death of his original owner in 1832, Scott had been purchased by a man named John Emerson, and upon his death, Scott and his family would then be transferred to the ownership of Emerson's wife, Irene. Previously, Scott and his family had been brought along for travels across multiple free states and territories, although at no point had they attempted to run or sue for their freedom. Instead, once Irene took ownership, Scott attempted to buy their freedom off her. Irene was obstinate and insisted on keeping her slaves around, which led Dred and his wife Harriet to, finally, go the route of a lawsuit. They each filed on the basis of 2 Missouri statutes, as they were currently living with Irene in St. Louis. One stated that any slave taken to a free state would thus be free and could not be returned to enslavement even if they left the free state, while the other allowed for anyone to file a suit for wrongful enslavement. The Scott couple was given logistical support from abolitionists, fellow churchgoers, and ironically, the family of their previous owner. This allowed them to actually take their case to court, which was first shot down in 1847 on a technicality, but was given the option of a retrial.
This revolutionary new superheater can warm up any room in minutes without giant electricity bills.
Next trial would come in January of 1850, and this time, the Scots actually won their freedom. Irene, however, quickly appealed the decision to the Missouri
Ooh, I didn't know that. I did not know that. Wow. This is actually, wow. This is
Missouri
crazy.
Supreme
Okay.
Court. 2 years later, the court sided once more with Irene, thus re-enslaving the Scott family. Unwilling to give up now, Scott filed a federal lawsuit with the United States Circuit Court for the District of Missouri the following year. Before the case could be decided upon again, Irene would transfer the Scotts over to her brother, John Sanford, hence the name of the new case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. In the spring of 1854, the federal court ruled in favor of Sanford, thus prompting Scott to appeal yet again, now to the United States Supreme Court. This final trial would start on February 11, 1856, with a growing list of abolitionist and even politician supporters in favor of the Scots. Nevertheless, less than a month later, a decision was made, and once more, Dred Scott had lost. And not only this, but the judge most notably credited for the final ruling asserted that no African American even had the right to sue for anything in the federal court because they lacked the ability to be United States citizens. While the Scots would already have their freedom by
So what is the point of putting those laws there? I mean, those laws were clearly there that he stated before, the Missouri laws of like the wrongful enslavement, and like if you're in a free territory, you can sue if you were wrongfully being enslaved and whatnot. I mean, those laws shouldn't be there. That makes no sense. Like that completely contradicts the laws. Like if that's not true, then they then pass a law that says that. I mean, like I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense at all.
now, thanks to Irene's new abolitionist husband and the help of their old owner's family. The case itself was the final straw for many abolitionists. John Brown had now gone down in history as one of America's most
John Brown is the GOAT. I think he tried to make a rebellion or something like that.
infamous abolitionists, and on October 16th, 1859, he would prove exactly why. He warned an army watchman as he and a group of fellow abolitionists launched what would be an ambitious but ultimately failed raid on Harper's Ferry. After taking several hostages from the town and capturing the U.S. Armory and Arsenal, the raiders would be stalled by a local militia as General Robert E. Lee made his way into the town to wrap things up. Brown and his men had aimed to spark a local slave rebellion, but instead,
It's crazy to me how John Brown is painted as this very insane, very madman type of dude, but he in my personal opinion was the GOAT, the greatest of all times. I think more people should give more credit to him, but the way how he's painted out is not right. You know, I don't like the way how they paint him out as this old crazy madman. Like, come on now, there's a bunch of people who started rebellions and uprisings the same exact way as John Brown. But yeah, you know, when he does it because he wants to start a slave rebellion, you know, he's a madman, he's infamous, you know, it's stupid.
many of the raiders were killed once Lee and his Marines arrived, with Brown himself being captured and later hanged for his acts of treason against the state of Virginia. John Brown had failed, and he had died. But his animosity for the South was shared by far too many for the tide to be turned by this point. With the election of anti-slavery Northerner Abraham Lincoln in 1860 to the presidency, enough was enough. Immediately after the future emancipator was elected to office, the South Carolina General Assembly called for a convention to consider secession. Much to the pleasure of the locals, South Carolina thus voted unanimously to leave the United States of America. Days later, they issued a document justifying their decision to secede and making one dramatically important point in the process. A geographical line has been drawn
The real estate market is rapidly shifting, so if you're thinking about selling a house anywhere in the Jacksonville
across the Union. And it truly had. 10 more southern states would follow suit and join the newly founded Confederate States of America, led by their chosen.
You know what's interesting is the fact that Missouri and Kentucky and I think that's Delaware. What's that state next to Delaware? I'm not sure. The one with Washington D.C. They had slaves, did they not? I think they fought on the North. I think they were like neutral at first or something, but they eventually like were like fighting on the side of the North. And even when Abraham Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, these states still had their slaves, right? So, because I know Abraham Lincoln did not have intentions on instantly taking away the slaves, but I find it funny how like everyone just completely just ignores Missouri, Kansas, and that other slave state right there that did have slavery throughout the entire Civil War, even throughout Emancipation Proclamation. I mean that should have been like proof enough, which is, you know, it's sad because he got assassinated after the Civil War by a hardliner, but
chosen president, Jefferson Davis. The Union president, Abraham Lincoln, refused to recognize the Confederacy as legitimate, insisting that he wished to take no one's slaves and simply wanted to keep the Union together. This meant nil to the Southerners, who were rapidly attempting to create a unified nation out of a handful of states who had all made a big fuss about state autonomy. And not just that, but the South was at a major disadvantage for the impending war. Precise numbers are debated, but it can be estimated that at the time of the mass secession and formation of the Confederacy, the Union boasted a population of roughly 22 million in comparison to the South's approximate 9 million. Of those numbers, the Union would eventually enlist around 2 million soldiers, whilst the Confederates would only tally about 900,000. Furthermore,
what, dude? This was this was just bound to like. There's no way the South could have freaking. Also, weren't half of this slaves? Like, I think a good 4 million of those were slaves too. Oh my goodness. Oh wow, they were bound to lose from the start. I mean, they legit declared a losing battle. Oh my goodness.
the Northerners had something close to 20,000 miles worth of railroads, which was double what the Confederate states could claim, thus giving the Union a better advantage for moving troops and supplies in wartime. And while it's often argued that the Confederate generals, such as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Patrick Cleburne gave the South a tactical military edge on their upstairs neighbors, the North was surely ahead in other ways, like the fact that they produced around 90% of goods in the former United States at the time. But still, the Union was losing its grip on the South. It only had limited holdings left in Confederate states, and it was about to lose another. Fort Sumter was the last Union stronghold in South Carolina, and strong is being generous. It was outmanned and undersupplied, to say the least, and with Southerners now cracking down on Union property within their borders, it was surrounded. The Confederates attempted to force the little remaining Union forces at the fort to surrender. The latter refused, and the Confederates opened fire. The Civil War had begun.
That was a good video. So, here's my take on this. The Civil War started because, well, in my personal opinion, the South was too agrarian. Their economy was way too freaking agrarian. And like he said in the video, they failed to industrialize. Not only that, but like the South was bound to lose, even if they had the generals. They were bound to lose the war of attrition. I mean, like, holy Jesus. I knew they were outnumbered and outmatched, but I didn't know it was that bad. That is actually crazy. I'm probably gonna react to part two another day, but holy Jesus, that is wild to me. I mean, like in the way how the British Empire abolished slavery, it wasn't even like that bad. There were a few like influences, like in Barbados, there were like Buster's slave rebellion in Barbados. It was the largest slave rebellion in the island's history. It was put down by the British, and not just the British. It was also put down by the colored people, some of the free people that were colored, because a lot of people forget that free people of color also exist. So, slavery wasn't just all black and white like what people think. But yeah, but that rebellion, it did influence the British Empire to abolish slavery, because when the reports of that rebellion had spread to England and throughout England and whatnot, a lot of abolitionists in England were her, and not just the abolitionists, but a lot of the people in England were also really, really, really livid about getting rid of slavery. But in America, I mean, Jesus, man, this is just, and the whole states' rights thing. You, the way how I interpreted that is, the states wanted the right to do their own slaves. That's basically what. It's basically their way of sugarcoating and saying, "Hey, we wanna have slaves," but the federal government is messing with that, and that's messing with our states' rights. So that's how I interpret states' rights. People try to bring up a whole bunch of BS about it and what's not. Eh, nah. It's plain and simple. They wanted the right to do slavery and whatnot, you know. But yeah, guys, thank you for watching the video. If you want more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. Drop my Discord server down in the description below so that you have early notifications of my YouTube videos. I'm going to be doing a lot more historical reactions like this because I enjoy history and I love history and I love learning about history or refreshing my brain about history. So make sure to like and subscribe for more of that. Thank you for watching and goodbye.